Welcome to the Illuminations Media Network.
And I believe that we are recording. So welcome back to the Illuminations Media Network. I'm Tamara Westwood, your host, and this is a special show because this is our very first video broadcast in a very, very long time. I'm glad that you're joining me today. We're going to be talking about some extremely fascinating topics. We're going to be talking about perhaps alternate worlds, other life forms, and this whole feeding frenzy that might be going on here on planet Earth. You know, scientists are discovering new species all the time, on the Earth, in the air, in the water, even signs of life on other planets and the sun. And all spiritual traditions all over the world talk about non-physical beings making contact with us. Non-physical beings that can take on physical form. Some even hijack the bodies and minds of animals and people. In the case of possessions and walk-ins, we've all heard about these instances. We've all experienced the idea that maybe my thoughts aren't my own. You know, maybe sometimes an intrusion comes in and we don't know where it came in. Maybe a thought plagues us and we can't let it go or shake it. What do we need to know about these voices? You know?
Well, the first thing is that your thoughts are not your own. That's the biggest one.
Yes.
They come from somewhere. And I remember asking after a couple of years in the PhD program, I was waiting for, okay, where do thoughts come from? And they weren't about to even deal with it. So I raised my hand in a lecture series one day and I asked the head of the department, where do thoughts come from? And he looked at me like I'd just fallen out of a spaceship at his feet. It's like, didn't know what to say. But that is what I needed to know. How the mind works depends on that. Where do they come from? And I knew from watching schizophrenics that I suspected that these voices they were hearing were thoughts. I mean, they were their thoughts. Mm-hmm. And it looked like it was their thoughts until I realized how destructive they were. These guys were constantly sabotaging themselves. And when I first started at Central State Hospital, which was at the time still the biggest in the world, I mean, it sprawled over, 2,000 acres with 200 buildings. And I think at the time I was there, it had like 13,000 patients. I mean, it was huge. It was a city. Mm-hmm. Every mental illness known to man was to be found somewhere in there. And being young and stupid, I thought that was great because I was interested in abnormal psychology. And that was the happening place, although it was in the middle of nowhere in central Georgia at the time. Mm-hmm. So when I first got there, what I started noticing is that these psychotic guys were doing crazy, destructive things. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I remember was one of them cut off his penis. And they said,
Hold it, Jerry, before we go there. I want our viewers to know who you are. My guest today is Jerry Marzinsky. As you can hear, he knows exactly what he's talking about. He's had 30 years of experience working with psychiatric patients. And as he's saying, he did this in Georgia. He also did it in the Arizona prison system. And he has some fascinating experiences, as you heard him begin, speaking about chopping off body parts that many of us see as vital. Continue, Jerry.
All right. So, it was the grapevine was the central cafeteria where all the staff met, and there was no iPhone, there was no internet back at that time. So everything that was happening at the hospital flew through the hospital cafeteria. So when I heard that, I found that one of the counselors I worked with worked in that unit were with the guy who had done this. So at dinner one day, I said, "Hey Ed, go ask that guy why he did that." You know, nobody's asking them anything. Nobody's talking to these people. They're just crazy. So everybody just ignores them because they're crazy. I'm like,
Right.
well, ask him why he did that. So he came back the next day. I met him at breakfast, and I said, "Well, what did he tell you?" And he said, "Well, he said he didn't need it." I'm like, "Well, okay."
Okay.
You know? But it was a series of these strange things like that where it was all negative. It was all destructive. They were killing themselves at a horrendous rate. Their suicide rate was astronomical. The graveyard there contained like 130, I think it was 130,000 graves all the way back to the Civil War. So Sherman camped his troops around this hospital during the Civil War. That's how old it is.
My goodness.
And some of the buildings were almost as old.
And it was a hospital back then?
It was. And it was run better back then than it was when I was there.
Uh-oh.
So, it was a series of these kind of things, the horrendous suicide rate. They brought one guy into, they called it the building for the criminally insane. And every time I walked past it, it would be like, what's in there? And nobody in the cafeteria knew anybody who worked there. Everybody would meet at the kitchen, but none of the staff from there worked there. And they wouldn't let us go in there. It was the only building in the hospital we couldn't get into. You had to work there to get in there. So they called it the building for the criminally insane. Mm-hmm. And stories would come out of there. And one of which was a airline pilot who had murdered his wife because he believed that she was turning his son into a homosexual. So here's this guy flying airlines, and then the next day he ends up in that building. So
something took hold of him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was what they call a delusional disorder for sure. But the kind of schizophrenia that I'm talking about, or we'll be talking about here, is paranoid schizophrenia. There's a lot of different kinds.
Mm-hmm.
There's the hebephrenics and there's the disorganized. The paranoids are the ones that are paranoid, and they're usually hearing voices.
Right.
Now, psychiatry insists that those voices are hallucinations. So, I saw there was a conflict there because at the state hospital, if the psychiatrist found out that the voices were telling a patient to kill himself, they would lock him up right away. They'd fill him full of drugs, and he'd be locked up until he was no longer suicidal.
So that was when they would intervene at that point.
At that point. And that's the only point at which they gave the voices any credence. Now, that's not all the voices were saying, but if they heard that, they reacted to it as if it was very real. Right. But all this other stuff was supposed to be a hallucination. So here's a schizophrenic thing on their part. All this other stuff is hallucinations, but the high suicide rate and the voices telling these people to kill themselves wasn't. And I'm like, well, why are they paying attention to that? And they're not paying attention to anything else these voices are telling them. So they kept insisting they were hallucinations. And I wanted to know what they were saying. It's like, what are they telling these people? Because they're always in trouble. They're always in trouble. They're always sabotaging themselves. They're always hurting themselves. They're hurting other people. It's always negative stuff.
Wow.
And it was hard to break into that, because by the time they got to the state hospital, well, first of all, the same thing I went through when I started learning about this, there's nobody you can talk to. So if they talk to anybody about this, they're deemed crazy. Their parents are all upset. The stuff the voices are telling them is oftentimes so horrendous that they're embarrassed to talk about it. So they get drug into a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist says, oh yeah, you're psychotic. You're hallucinating. Your voices are hallucinations. What you're hearing isn't real. Your brain is broken due to a chemical brain imbalance. There's nothing you can do about it. There's no cure. So we're going to put you in the hospital, and we're going to fill you full of these potent toxic drugs, and this is the treatment. Now those drugs cured nothing. All they did was suppress the psychotic symptoms,
Mhm.
and the patients hated them because of the side effects. They were awful side effects,
Right.
but not as bad as being psychotic.
Well, Jerry, maybe we can get into these deeper experiences, that you had with these clients and with the inmates in the second half.
Mhm.
But right now, I would like to speak to how we can decipher, you know, whether or not we're just hearing voices because these are our own thoughts, or these are intrusions that are coming from elsewhere. How would we distinguish?
Well, that's a very good question. Number one, and Sherry, I hope you talked to her at some point along the line too.
Yes.
She was struggling with these things as a young woman, and beat them with the same kind of information that I was learning the hard way,
Mhm.
and ended up working as a civil engineer on multi-million-dollar projects. So she clarified that. Um, with the information I had, and I overlaid it and tested it out on the front lines. Every negative thought you have about yourself comes from them.
Wow. Every negative.
Every you have about yourself comes from them.
Wow.
You know. Now, when I first heard that, I misinterpreted it, and I knew that what the voices were telling these people were negative thoughts. They sounded just like their own thoughts. There wasn't any change in timbre or voice tone or any. It sounded like them speaking to them, which made things very difficult because people think that if it appears in your mind, it must be yours. That's
Right.
just what we're told. You know, it's
And of
your
course,
thoughts. It's your
there
mind.
is the school of thought of the subconscious mind,
Yeah.
that we have negative patterns and negative thoughts from the past, or ideas that we've bought into from the pillars of socialization, right?
Yep. Yep.
Ah,
So,
interesting.
so that one is pretty solid. So when I first heard her tell me that, I went, that matches what I found. But she put it in such a succinct form. I said, this is great. It's a lot easier to remember than what the information I was telling patients, which was a lot more spread out. I mean, it was the same information, but she had made it very concise. So I took what she told me into the ER one night. And with one of the psychotic guys that night, I told him, well, every negative thought you have that comes into your mind is them. And the voices lashed back out at me, and they said, that's not true. And this is the voices talking. They said, look at that wall is green, isn't it? And I looked at the wall and I said, well, yeah, it's green. And they said, is that a lie? I said, well, no, I guess not. So I went back to Sherry and I said, well, wait a minute, this happened. And she said, every negative thought about yourself, not every negative thought,
Right.
you
Okay.
know. So the one you can count on is the negative thought about yourself does not come from you. It's not the light being that you are composed of. You know, it's not yours. It's designed to create turmoil and negative emotional energy, which is what these things feed off of. So if you monitor your thoughts, and we've got to do this better, and you see one of those come in, turn it around and go, this does not belong in my thought stream. Get out. You know?
And Jerry, that makes it easier to do when you recognize that it's not coming from you,
Shoot, yeah.
that it
Matter of
is
fact,
foreign.
it is foreign.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there were three groups of three types of psychotic patients. The ones who thought the voices were demons and negative entities.
Okay.
The ones who weren't sure, and the ones who bought into psychiatry's bullcrap about there being hallucinations and their brain is broken. The ones who recovered the most were the ones who felt these things were not them.
Okay.
Because now
Whether they were demons or whatever they were just not me. That's
right, they
important.
weren't them. So that
Mhm.
puts out um, a distance. It's no longer you, that you don't understand why you're doing these crazy things and why you're thinking these crazy things. It's
Right.
something else. It's not you. And that dichotomy has to be made if they're going to recover. You
Right.
know?
And so what you're saying, Jerry, is that everyone has these intrusions.
Yes.
We all have these thoughts, but what makes people like paranoid schizophrenics experience it on a deeper, more devastating level?
Well, from what I've seen on the front lines is most of these people were either physically, sexually, emotionally traumatized.
Some
I mean,
trauma.
so they had that programming to start with. So what
Okay.
these entities are after is negative emotional energy, and they're attracted to that like sharks are attracted to blood. I mean, they will just float right in there, and the prisons are a major feeding source of that. You know,
Wow.
so you can
So
actually.
Jerry, we're not at the top of the food chain. Uh-oh,
Uh-oh,
you just
there you
froze.
go.
There, you're
Yeah, it
back.
froze.
So
Okay.
you're not on top of the food chain? You and
Oh
I are
no,
at the
no,
top.
we're not. So if you look at the way nature works, I mean, everything from the smallest bacteria all the way up the line is feeding on something bigger.
Right,
Okay.
trying to eat,
Now,
survive.
when you get to us, okay, we're the basically the top here, but then that moves into a spiritual level where there are other entities who are feeding off of us. And in order to do that, they must turn your emotional state negative because they can't produce that energy on their own. It,
Wow.
they, it has to be negative emotional energy because they can't stand positive. You know. So
And so
people,
like a virus is like a parasite that is feeding off of us physically and replicating itself with the intent to take over the physical body, consume it, if you will, or whatever. But these invisible, disincarnate parasites, they're drawing from our energy.
yes, that they're taking your life energy after turning it negative. So, for the therapists who are out there who work with these people, you know, this they don't notice this, but it's very important. Is that after the voices attack and leave, those guys are drained. They have
Yeah.
no energy. They're depressed. They can't get out of bed.
Mhm.
And you point that out to the patient, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, after the voices come, I I'm devastated. I don't have any energy. I can't get out of bed." But they cannot make the connection between the voices appearing tens of thousands of times and they're draining them. And you can point that out. You can even say,
Mhm.
okay, if these things come, some of them have been hearing them for decades. You go, okay, well, you've probably heard them 10,000 times, and every time they came after they left, you were drained. What
Yeah.
happened to your energy? You didn't use it. And they go, well, I don't know.
Wow.
And I'd say, okay, if you stuck your hand in the fire 10 times, and each time you stuck your hand in the fire, you got ball saying it's the fire. Not at all. But then you go, okay, you switch it around again and go, okay, if every time these voices come, you're drained of energy, what's taking your energy? Where's it going? Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Very few of them were able to hit that. And that's the very last thing these entities want us to know, is that they do exist and that they are draining all of us. Now, the normal guy who's probably sitting out there going, oh, this is all bullcrap, the way they would hit him is, he's walking down the sidewalk one day minding his business, and
Right.
then all of a sudden this horrible thought comes into his head that is just sends the hair up on your back, and you go, my heavens, that's awful. Why am I even thinking that? And it's kind of, you shudder. You never act on anything like that. You hardly ever think about anything like that. And
Right.
here comes this thought, just barges in there. Oh, stab your grandmother, or drive your car into oncoming traffic, or, it's like, where did that come from?
Mhm.
Because it doesn't belong to you, and it doesn't belong to you. You don't think that way. It's just this massive intrusion that just barged in there, and went boom. All right. So that's how most of us can clearly see these things. But their end game is to produce negative emotional energy. So they play on guilt a lot. So if you do something you're guilty about, they'll just keep feeding it. It's like
Wow.
pouring gasoline on the fire until you feel bad, and then you'll notice that you're being drained.
Now, Jerry, this makes me think about generalized anxiety, depression, all these things. When an individual, and when I, speak with clients, I speak with people a lot with generalized anxiety. They may have anxiety attacks from time to time that come out of the blue, or supposedly out of the blue. Then there may be the issues with long-term and tiresome depressive periods that show up afterwards. Now, with that, Jerry, could this be our body's way of dealing with?
I thought that for years.
Mm-hmm.
Then one day I was assigned to the jail for the prison, which is the worst of the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And into my office come two letters, one from the captain of, the CDU, telling me that there's a psychotic prisoner who's standing over his roommate at 3 a.m. and staring down at him. And he wanted something done about that. They were locked in the same cell.
Mm-hmm.
And then in came a letter from the guy who, the prisoner who the psychotic guy was staring at 3 a.m. And the reason he was in there because he snitched off a drug deal. And the gangsters wanted him dead. And they wanted him dead so bad that they'd already stabbed him a couple of times. And they actually went out of their way to get into trouble so they could be sent to CDU so they can get this guy.
Oh,
That's how bad they wanted him dead. And they were shooting notes under his door saying, if you come out of there, we're going to kill you. So he couldn't come out without an armed guard, without a guard. And here's these two guys locked in the same cell together. Perfect experimental circumstances, same cell, same environment, same food, same everything. So I brought them up one at a time to the interview room, and I watched them as they come up the steps. The guy who the gangsters were trying to kill looked like Superman. He had tons of energy. He flew up those steps. He came, sat down. He told me what was going on, and you couldn't be under more anxious circumstances than that guy was in. Not only were the gangsters trying to kill him, he's got a psychotic, criminally insane guy in the same cell with him.
In the same cell, living
in the same cell, living with him, who's standing over him at 3 a.m, staring down at him in the dark. It doesn't get too much worse than that, except in war. And this guy had tons of energy, And then the psychotic guy who's eaten up by the voices comes out, and this other guy goes back, and he could barely make it up the steps. Once he got into the interview room, he had no energy. He could barely speak. And that blew my mind. I went, okay, it's not the anxiety that's caused by these things constantly hammering at them. It's something else. And I didn't know what that was exactly, but at that point, I knew it wasn't the anxiety. So I had to look for something else. Something else was causing this. And that's where the voices thing came in. When I knew that, I was reading something from a shaman, who are ignored by the medical people also.
Of course.
And he brought up the fact that these things were parasites. And I went, that matches what I've seen. So what I did is with one of the patients, the psychotic prisoners I was working with, who was making very good progress and had warned me, that the voices were getting pissed off. He was the one that came and told me the voices wanted to talk to me. And when they did, I think I mentioned to you early, he sat down, he looked at me, and I said, well, what do they have to say? And
Jerry, let us unpack this and step by step for our viewers.
I think we were talking about that ahead of time, and they didn't.
Right, in the green room. So break it on down step by step so they can get what was really going on there.
Okay. What was happening is that I knew whatever the voices were, they were destroying these patients. They were always telling them constantly negative things. So that's where I discounted psychiatry's bullcrap about there being hallucinations. Hallucinations are all over the place. They're positive, they're negative, they're random, they're just everything. The content is everywhere. There's no pattern to it.
Right.
There was a definite pattern to these voices, which they also totally ignore. They were always unswervingly negative and consistently derogatory and rotten.
About the individual.
About the individual. They'd tell them all kinds of rotten things about himself. You're no good. You're stupid. You're worthless. Nobody likes you. It goes on and on and on. You know, all kinds of negative crap, you know, about themselves.
Breaking them down.
Breaking them down. Now, not only that, they did the same thing with the prisoner, with the inmates, and as we do with prisoners of war. They wouldn't let them sleep. They come 2, 3 in the morning, and they're hounding them. They're screaming at them. They can't sleep. They're not eating. They're you know. So what these things are doing is the same thing to us that we do to cows. You know, you put them out in the field. They eat grass. They get fat. They make milk. We bring them in. We isolate them, and then we milk them, and then turn them loose again. They eat more grass. So that's what these things are doing. They drain these patients. They're
Oh, we got a little freeze there for a moment.
idea, but I've seen it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I have no idea how they do that, but I've seen it happen. You know, and the patient would just tell me, I mean, they're draining me right now. I can feel it. You know. Now, I didn't, before I was aware of this, while I was working with these guys, if I worked with more than 2 of them in a day, I would come home so drained from work that I couldn't function. So I made a rule for myself not to work with any more than 2 of them a day, and just 1.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So as we're experimenting with ways to interfere with these voices and what they're telling the patients, I was getting closer and closer, and there was more and more interference. Now, one thing I was able to do in the prison that I wasn't able to do in the psych hospital was that you know, you're not supposed to do anything in the hospital that upsets these patients. And talking to them about their voices upsets the voices.
Upsets them, of course.
Yeah. So psychiatry jumps down your throat, and I've been warned more than once, you know, do not ask them questions about the voices. They are hallucinations. You know, that's what they are. Quit messing around with this stuff. You're upsetting my patients, and they ordered me to stop it. Okay? So I had to kind of back off and wait until I got assigned to a different unit where I could start again, because I would have been in big trouble with them. Now, in the prison, that was a whole different environment. You know, a prisoner complaining about a psych asking him about his voices wouldn't even break the ambient noise level there. You know, so it was like, you know, nobody cared until the people started recovering. Then things got strange. So what I did is I brought in, after I was warned by my patients that what I was doing was dangerous, and I didn't think these things could come out of their head and get me. I mean, they lived in their head, not mine. You know, that's what I was thinking at the time. So I didn't think I was in any danger. And then the second time he comes in, and he says the voices are really getting pissed off with you. They're really getting angry. So I'm like, hey, this is getting personal.
Yeah.
And I'm like, still thinking, okay, they're in your head. They're not mine. They can't get me. They're yours. And then comes that same guy walks in without an appointment, looks me in the eye and said, the voices want to talk to you. And I'm like, what? You know, I'm like, yeah. It's like, this has never happened before. You know, for years it would be like, I'd ask them, well, what are the voices telling you? Well, they're telling me you're stupid and you're a jerk and I shouldn't listen to anything you say, and you're just a crazy lunatic and stuff like that.
Trying to break you down.
Well, they've said that about me all the time, you know. But what I had was a group of prisoners carefully selected who, and this was fairly rare, and the unit was big, so I had a lot to choose from, but only the ones who would tell me in real time what the voices were telling them were the ones that I worked with most intensely. And then I would, you know, okay, try this and report back next week, tell me how that worked. So as we experimented with different ways to weaken them and short circuit them, I was getting reports that they were getting more and more pissed off. And I'm like,
so Jerry, you're talking about ways that you would weaken these voices. Were these a combination of pharmaceutical and cognitive therapy? What were you using?
Well, it was to start off with, it was very primitive. You know, I remember I read a book called 30 Years Among the Dead by a dentist who was working with psychotic patients. And
Mhm.
what he would do would give them a shock of static electricity, which he reported the voices experienced as a lightning storm, and they hated it.
Oh, wow.
And that would drive them out. And his wife, who was a psychic, would then latch onto him and talk them into the light, which would get rid of them for good.
Wow. Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
so at the time, I was working with Wilson Van Dusen, who was the psychologist, the clinical psychologist in the hospital I told you up in Ukiah, who
Mhm.
was making friends with these things and trying to get information that way. I never saw them as friends. I always saw them as enemies. So I attacked them in a different manner and I got a different result.
Mhm.
So one of the things I found while I was at the state hospital, that the voices, I mean, the schizophrenic patients would not leave the ward to go to church, the church activities. So when they had an ice cream social with cake and all this stuff that the patients normally don't get, they all went except for the schizophrenics.
Okay.
And I watched, that was a pattern of that, you know? And
Mhm.
after a while, I started asking them about it. Hey, how come you're sitting up here in this dingy ward when everybody's out down there having a good time with ice cream and, you know, dancing and stuff? What are you doing up here? Why are you here? Well, I don't like preachers, you know. And I found out that the voices didn't like them reading the Bible. You know, they would tell me if I try to read the Bible, they get louder. And one of them, I remember, told me that, what makes you think Jesus is going to save you? He couldn't even save himself. You're wasting your time. They actually told him that.
Mhm.
So it was, you know, step by step, little
Mhm.
things like that. You know, what kind of hallucination would go off with somebody reading the Bible? You know, why
Right.
were they being,
There's some sentient being.
yeah, yeah. Why is it always negative? Why is it, you know, why are the hallucinations always negative? Um,
Mhm.
why can't they stand the person going into the church? And I
Mhm.
had stories by a number of them where they told me they went into the church, the voices got louder, and one of three things were happening, depending on how strong the voices were. If they were weak, they'd shut up. If they were moderate, they would just keep whacking away at the guy and screaming in his head so they couldn't hear what the preacher was saying. And
Mhm.
they'd put down the preacher, put down the church. And a lot of these guys would just kind of white knuckle it and sit through it, but they couldn't really hear the message because the voices were blotting it out. And
Right.
the third group is, and I've seen one or two of these where they just can't handle it. They jump up and they run.
We run
They
out.
run out of the church. And every time you see that happening, it's either a dire emergency or it's one of these guys whose voices can't deal with it anymore.
Wow.
So they kind of seem to sense that that's the direction they should be moving in, but they're blocked.
Mhm.
So what the other thing I found is that they hated the 23rd Psalm. One patient told me that when he read the 23rd Psalm, these things reacted like worms being thrown on a hot frying pan. And I went, well,
Whoa.
that's interesting. So what I did is printed up a bunch of 23rd Psalms, and by then, uh, I was trying to rack my brain with what I could use that would provide some kind of shock that would mimic the static electrical shocks that this dentist was giving his patients.
Mhm.
And I couldn't do anything that obvious because I'd be fired right on the spot.
Of course.
You know, so I'm racking my brain for about 2 months about, okay, how can I do this without getting in trouble? And I was standing by a secretary's desk one day and I saw this big rubber band there and I went, that's it. That's it. So I stole the rubber band, and with one of the guys I trusted, I said, here, wear this thing around your wrist. I'm going to
Mhm.
give you the 23rd Psalm. And when the voices start, you know, they couldn't remember to read the 23rd Psalm. That was the problem. And they'd lose it. So I'd give it to them. And I'm like, well, there's got to be something that'll temporarily shut the voices up so they can remember to read the 23rd Psalm, which the voices hated. So at least they had something to strike back with. You know, they weren't completely helpless. They had something they could hit back with. So uh, I gave them the rubber band. And I said, when you hear the voices, snap the rubber band, then repeat the 23rd Psalm. So
Okay.
the snap of the rubber band did shut the voices up for different lengths of time, you know, from 20 seconds to maybe a couple of minutes. So it shut them up so they couldn't interfere. The guy would then get out the 23rd Psalm and read it. And they hated that. So that was one of the first things I found. See, Wilson wasn't looking for a way to strike back at these things. I was. What can we do to give them a black eye? They're killing our patients. What can we do? That was the first thing. So what eventually happened was some of them snapped the rubber band so many times they either broke it or they had red wrists.
Injuries, yeah.
So when the chief psychologist found out what I was doing, I was ordered to stop immediately. So there went that experiment, but I saw that it did work.
Wow.
So as things went along and more things came up to interfere with those things, including they're lying to you about yourself. They're telling you stuff that's going to get you in trouble and making them realize that they weren't the patient. They weren't who you are. These things are separate.
They're outside.
Their intent does not match yours. And that was the biggest one. Their intention is to get you in trouble and destroy you. And I'd ask them, I said, was it your intent to get thrown in prison listening to the voices? They go, no, that wasn't my intent. They go, well, okay, then whose intent was it? You were following the voices. So, and if it wasn't your intent, whose intent was it? Well, I guess it was theirs. Well, yeah, I guess it was.
Jerry, what comes to mind is comorbidity. We think about that the majority of people who are in prison and who return to prison have some sort of addiction problem. Now,
yes.
Could these people be self-medicating in order to quiet these voices?
Yes, that's exactly what happens. And the voices want them to use specific drugs. And top of their list is amphetamine. And I've seen more prisoners go crazy on amphetamine, meth, than any other drug out there. The prisoners called it the devil's drug. They would start seeing shadow people, which I investigated some because I wasn't sure what they were. But yeah, they're going psychotic in massive numbers using meth, and they don't come back. For a long time, they start hearing voices. They go, well, that's a hallucination, which is what psychiatry told them, So yeah, they think, and then when they stop, the voices go away, and they do that for a while, and then one day they don't. They're there forever. Now the voices want them to use drugs like alcohol, cocaine, amphetamine that feel good at first, but then have a horrible withdrawal, which turns their mental state negative. Okay. Now, what I found interesting is that they don't like marijuana. They don't want the patient using marijuana because it calms them down and there's no withdrawal effect. So they're telling these patients, don't use marijuana, use alcohol. And I was like, whoa, why marijuana? And then I thought, well, it doesn't have a withdrawal effect. It doesn't have a nasty thing that upsets your system and makes you all agitated and angry. It calms you down, just like the psychiatric drugs calm them down. So that was interesting.
That is. And so these shadow people,
that's a whole different ballpark. Those guys.
Are they connected to the voices, do you think, or is that something?
No, I don't think so. What they are is three-dimensional shadows that the meth addicts would report seeing, and they had no faces. And what was interesting is sometimes they had hats and capes and all kinds of other stuff, but they couldn't see their faces. And then one guy reported that he saw one that had eyes. So as soon as I found out something like this, I'd start asking all of them, okay, this one guy told me this. Have you had that same experience? So it wasn't based on just one guy. It was based on scores of guys that I asked the same question to.
Right.
So all the meth guys saw these shadow beings. They could walk through walls.
Shared sightings? Any instances of that? Or maybe there were two people together and they were both using meth and they both saw them?
You know what? Did you hear about that experiment? Maybe from Freeman, I don't know. There was one inmate, and this guy was fascinating. He said he and his friend, who were both injecting meth, wanted to see if they both saw the same thing. So what they did is they got their needles and stuff, and they went out to an Indian reservation, 30 miles south of here in the middle of nowhere.
Mhm.
And they wanted to see if they both saw the same thing. So one of them shot up and waited until they started appearing. And then he started pointing them out and saying, well, you see that one over there? No. Well, how about that one standing next to the tree? No, I don't see. So they determined that they had to be on the meth to see them, because the one guy could, the other guy who didn't use the meth couldn't. So he shot up, and then they started comparing notes. Well, you see the one over there by the cactus? Yeah, I see him. Well, what's he doing? Well, he's moving to the left. Oh yeah, that's right. So they determined they were both seeing the same thing. Now, one thing that they told me that was really strange is that these entities, whatever they are, and I'm still not sure what they are, but I don't think they're the same thing as the voices. They're something else. That if they saw that they were being watched, they would move toward the person watching them. So they knew that they could be seen, and they would move toward whoever was watching them.
Mhm.
And then in 99% of the cases, whoever was looking at them saw them coming, they took off. They didn't wait for them
Any
to.
experiences of what would happen? I mean, did these shadow people interact at all physically?
I've spoken to some patients who could feel them walk through them. So there was a noticeable feel of walking through. But what happened to these two guys that were studying these things is, as they were watching them, they were surrounded by them. There were like scores of them that came out of the desert, and they were closing in on these two guys.
Ooh,
And they're standing there to their pickup truck, and then they noticed they were surrounded, so they jumped in the pickup truck, locked the
got out of
doors.
there.
Well, not yet. Not yet. They're sitting
No?
in there, locked the truck, and they're watching these things from inside the truck. And then all of a sudden, the guy said the back of the truck just went down like a giant boulder hit it, and the front jumped up. And I'm like, what?
What?
That was my first hint that these things could affect physical reality.
Right.
And that got my attention because I didn't think they could. And I asked him, I said, well, what did you do? And then he said, well, we got out of there like a bat out of hell and almost wrecked the truck doing it. And I said, well, they filled up the back of the truck. That's what, he said they looked back and the back of the truck was just teeming with these things. And I said, well, what happened after you got out of there? Did they follow you? And he said, no, they didn't follow me.
Wow.
So with more stories that came up, I found out that the more regressed amphetamine addicts can actually see their eyes. And those eyes are either red or they're lime green, no other color. And what that told me, I used that as a clinical indicator as to how far gone that guy was. The ones who don't see the eyes aren't as worse off as the ones who do see the eyes.
Interesting.
Those guys are in much worse shape.
Whew.
And then
Our world.
so I still didn't know what these things were. I've only seen them out of the corner of my eye. I've never seen them clearly like these other guys. And then one day, this was on Christmas Eve, I was covering the ER on Christmas Eve. Hardly anything was going on. And this one guy comes in shaking like a leaf. I mean, he's just shaking like a leaf.
Mm.
And after talking with him for a few minutes, it was clear he was psychotic and he'd been on meth. I asked him, well, how long have you been on meth? So I've been injecting for 10 years. And I'm like, he should have been dead by then. I mean, he shouldn't even be here. And I'm like, whoa. So right away, my attention's peaked. So, well, you ever see the shadow people? Oh, yeah, I see them all the time. You seen their eyes? Yeah, I see their eyes. Well, what color are they? Lime green. So here I am asking him more and more questions. I figured if anybody knew more about these things than anybody else, it would be this guy, because he's been doing that stuff for decades and he's still alive. So I said, have they ever spoken to you? Because I've never spoken to anyone, and that's probably scores of different patients who'd seen them. None of them said that they spoke to them. They don't talk. So just out of the blue, I asked this guy, well, you ever spoke to him? He said, yeah. So right away, my attention got, boom. It's like, whoa, okay. And I said, well, what did they sound like? And he mimicked this high-pitched squeaky voice that just kind of, just a mimic of it sent the hair on my back straight up,
Mm.
you know, and it's like, whoa. And I said, what did they say to you?
Mm.
And at that moment, that he was shaking the whole time he was in my office. I mean, he was just shaking. He couldn't stop. From the whole time he was in the ER, he was shaking. When I asked him that question, he went dead still. He wasn't shaking at all. He went dead still. And he looks at me, and then his eyes get real wide black. And man, I could feel this hatred pouring out of them. That was no longer the guy I was talking to. I mean, I looked into these pools of like this cold hatred that I've never seen or experienced before. It was like, it just went forever. And this being, whatever it is just staring at me, and I'm staring at it, and we're looking each other in the eye. And I'd learned long ago that you don't back down from these things, you know, but I'm sitting there staring at it and going like, how much longer is this going to go on? You know, it's like,
Okay.
whoa, you know, and then boom, he's right back. He came back. This was the guy I was talking to before, and he's shaking again, you know, but I wanted to know what they told him.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to deal with that thing again. So
Oh.
I went, what did they tell you? And he said, they told me to go jump in front of a car, 2 cars, and I wouldn't get hurt. And I said, well, what'd you do? He said, well, I went out to the road and I jumped in front of first one car and then another. And I said, you get hit? And he said, yeah, I got hit and thrown across the road. And I said, well, what happened? He said, when I woke up, they were standing all around me. And they said, get up, you're not hurt. He said he got up and he wasn't hurt. And then that thing came back again right after that question. And it's staring at me again. And I'm like, oh my God, you know, it's like, oh, it seemed to go on for eternity. And then it
Strangeness.
just faded back out again, and he came back, you know. So when it came back, he went stark still again, you know. And then, you know, here's the eyes that staring at me with that cold hatred. And then I went, I can't handle this anymore. I sent him out to the psych nurse to do her part. She couldn't even deal with him for 20 seconds before she came into me and said, what'd he tell you? I'll use your report. You know, so that's as much as I know about these things. And I still don't know quite what they are.
But we're talking about two different
things. They are not the voices. The shadow people are not the voices. They seem to be some kind of watchers, because that's what they're doing. They're watching everybody. They're especially these patients. They appear darker than the rest of the room at night, and they're standing there watching them, or they're standing over them watching them. If they turn on the light, they disappear. They can walk through walls. Physical matter doesn't bother them at all, but they never seem to harm the patient. I mean, they never, I never got reports that the patient was feeling drained or attacked, just freaked out. So I still don't know what they are. But you can find them on the internet. I mean, there's tons of sites on the internet with the shadow people.
Wow. Wow. Our world is getting stranger and stranger.
Well, it's a whole nother world that we've been ignoring the whole time, you know. Yeah. And the mystics and the shaman have been telling us about these things for hundreds of years. And psychiatry comes up and go, oh yeah, that's a bunch of bull crap. Even though it's mentioned in the Bible, you know, evil spirits being driven out of people are mentioned in the Bible some 23 times. But all of a sudden psychiatry comes up and goes, that's fairy tales. You know, evil spirits don't exist. They're hallucinations.
Wow. So it seems that there is a feeding on negative emotions.
Yes, that's what they feed off of, negative emotional energy.
Mm-hmm.
And they will do whatever they can to generate that in the individual.
Wow.
So they don't want people moving along a positive spiritual path. And that's the only thing that'll keep them away. You know, so it is possible to drive them out, but, you know, like the Bible said, you know, you can drive them out, but if you leave the room empty, they're going to come back. They need to change their frequency. They have to realize that if there's a dark side, there's also an angelic side. You know, there are angelic beings that don't speak like the negative ones do. They speak in terms of feelings and intuition. And the clearest I've seen them come through is in all the patients who have attempted suicide, and there was some miraculous intervention that just you know, it couldn't logically have ever happened.
Right. Many speak of angels,
Yes.
appearing
Yeah.
out of nowhere to rescue them.
Yeah, there was one gal, I was working in the ER at this time. Everything had gone wrong in her life. She lost her job. She was about to lose her house and be evicted. Her son was taken away from her. I mean, everything was going wrong. So she didn't have anything to kill herself around her apartment. So she decided, well, okay, I'm going to get drunk and drugged up. I'm going to drive down to Benson, wait at the train track for a train to come by, and then I'm going to drive my car in front of the train, and I'm going to end all this. This is, I can't deal with it anymore.
Mm.
So she did that. She was on the phone to her sister in San Diego, telling her sister goodbye when the train came. So as the train's approaching, she drove around that barrier right onto the train track. The first train slammed her car, threw it into the second track where another train was coming. That second train hit it also, and then threw it some 50 yards off the road. And here she was in this
Tell me
crumpled
she
piece of metal. She survived, not only survived, the only thing she had was a black eye and a bloody nose. That was it.
Wow.
And they had to cut her out of it.
Hmm.
And then another one, just a few days later, she got a 357 Magnum. Now, that's what they say it is. I still have a hard time believing it, but that's what the report said. It was a 357 Magnum. She put it up to her chest and fired it. The round went all the way through her, through the wall, out the apartment, and she missed all vital organs. And here she is sitting in front of me just hours later with a big Band-Aid on both sides. And I'm like, how did that happen?
Wow.
So I asked the one who got hit by the train, I said, what were you thinking when you found out you weren't dead? And she said, I was furious. She said, I was absolutely furious, that I wasn't dead. And then she said she heard her name being called. And then she felt this relaxation like I felt in the airplane when that was about to crash.
Oh, you're going to have to share that story.
That's a long story. So, and then she was told that everything was going to be okay, that she was being watched over, and that changed her around. Now, both of those patients I found not to be a suicidal threat after evaluating them, but I didn't think psychiatry was going to let them out of there because of the severity of what they did, and they did. I recommended that they're no longer suicidal. They learned their lesson, and they should be released. They don't qualify for psychiatric hospitalization at this point. And I was shocked that they let them both out of there.
Well, that was a win. Yeah.
Yeah, for those guys.
Yeah. Wow.
So what these things absolutely don't want you to know is that they do exist and that they are predatory parasites feeding off you. So as I was learning that, and I was being warned by my patients, what you're doing is dangerous. This was after the guy said the voices want to speak to you, and they warned me, you have no right to do this.
Yeah, no right to, what was that?
These are their exact words, and his voice tone changed just minimally. And these words poured out of his mouth. They said, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. And I was like staring at him like, boom. It's like my head was like, okay. Because up to that point, I didn't want to believe they were evil spirits. I was thinking it was some deranged part of their subconscious.
Right.
But my denial system was already in shambles because as the information was mounting, I just kept denying it because I didn't want to, I didn't want to think that I'm dealing with evil spirits and I'm surrounded with evil spirits. And now they're warning me to stop doing what I'm doing to try to help these guys, and it was getting strangely personal. So I ran into, I think it was Miguel Ruiz was speaking about them being predatory parasites. Carlos Castaneda does the same thing.
Yes.
So I brought one of those books in, and I brought that patient who told me that into the office. And I said, I'm going to read you a passage from this book as to what this shaman thinks these things are. And I'd like you to tell me what your voices do in reaction. So what I did is that and this could only be done in a prison, is when you do something that they don't like and they get all hyped up, you keep giving them more of the same. You couldn't do that in a hospital.
Don't back down. No.
Yeah, well, you had to in the hospital because these guys got upset. And then when psychiatry found out you're upsetting them because you're trying to find out what's going on, then they jump down your throat and order you to stop. But in the prison, it was like, okay, all right, they don't like this, give them more of the same. Just keep doing that, you know. So,
you know, Jerry, that seems like an important tip for us to understand.
Yeah, that and that it is not your intention. So what the shaman was saying, that these are predatory parasites, and I read that to him, and you know, in the middle of reading it, soon as that came up, soon as that concept came up, I looked up at him to see what he was thinking, and he was like frozen, like an icicle, just staring at me, you know, with this glazed look on his eyes. And I'm like, uh-oh, I'm in big trouble, you know, and he said nothing. And I'm looking at him, and it was really odd. And then all of a sudden, from behind my head was this loud electrical crackling, just like an arc welder. It was like crack, 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 crack. And it went from behind me up my wall, office wall, to the right at a 45-degree angle. Crack, 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 all loud. And it just kept progressing up that wall till it got to the ceiling. And I'm like, this guy's going to attack me. So I pushed the chair back against the wall and was waiting for him to come. And of course, they always sign a female officer to the medical unit who would have been worthless. I mean, it would have been determined one way or another by the time she got there. So I pushed against the wall, waiting to kick him if he came at me. And I didn't want to take my eyes off him, but you know, what the hell was going on with this crackling? So I'm like glancing between him and this crackling,
Right.
Watching him to see if he's going to get up and get me, and then trying to figure out what's causing this crackling. And I could see nothing. I could smell nothing. It was just this loud crackling, and it just went all the way up the wall. And then it started across the back wall, and he was sitting against that wall. So it was easy to watch him and watch the crackling at the same time. So I asked him, I said, do you hear that? And he just kept staring at me with this zombie-like look. He didn't respond. He's just staring at me with this glazed over look. You know, I'm like, what is going on? And that thing kept that went on for like 30 or 45 seconds. I mean, it wasn't just a little, and then it comes down the left wall and it's moving toward me. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? And I'm watching him, and then it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can right at my feet. And I looked down in there, and it had been cleaned by the inmate porter the night before. There wasn't nothing in there. And I'm looking, and it's crackling in there right next to my feet. And then, you know, I look at him, look at that, and then all of a sudden it stops. And he slowly gets up very rigidly, like a robot or a zombie or something. And he goes, I gotta leave. And I'm like, hey, go, go.
Whoa.
So he kind of shuffles down the hall. It wasn't his normal gait. And I'm like, thank God he's gone. And I'm sitting there absolutely stunned. I'm like, what the devil just happened? And, you know, I look around the walls. I get up and I'm inspecting the walls to see if they're burnt, if there's any kind of electrical thing. Nothing. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't smell anything. There was nothing there. So I ran out in the hall and I checked all the other doors, and none of the other medical staff were in. There was no doctors in. There were no nurses in yet. I was the first one. All those doors were locked. There was nothing that could account for that. So I went back to my office,
to the
and
Illuminations
I
Media
canceled
Network.
all my appointments for that day and just sat there stunned. Like,